Hi guys, welcome to this video on skill classification. This is part of the skill acquisition in sport series. So in this video, we're just going to talk very briefly about one thing, and that is how can skills be classified? How can we categorize them? What different kinds of classes or categories of skills are there? Let's get started. So there are several ways that we can actually classify different skills in sport. We're going to look at 5 in this video. First off, and maybe a little bit vaguely, we're going to start off by thinking about types of skill in sport. And what I mean by that really is, where is the skill located? Secondly, we're going to think about the effect of the environment on the skill. So to what extent is the environment a key part in the way that the skill is performed? To what extent does the environment dictate the performance of the skill? Thirdly, we'll talk about the precision of the movement required for the skill. Then the distinctiveness of the beginning and the ending of the skill. And finally, we'll think about how the skill is paced, or how the skill is timed, and who has a control over, or who has a say over the pacing and the timing of the skill. So let's start off with types of skill then. So the first way of classifying skills is by type of skill. And as I've already said, what I mean by this really is where the skill is located. So are we talking about the sort of skill that can be understood to be a cognitive skill? So that's a skill that requires thinking, a skill of processing within the brain essentially. And those might be things like working at angles in snooker, where to hit the cue ball off a cushion in order to pick the right angle to make the next shot. Or it might be working out scores, perhaps in darts, knowing the score that you need to finish. So those would be cognitive skills, and we could classify some skills as cognitive skills in sport. There are other skills that we might classify as perceptual skills. That is our perception, our ability to sense what's going on around us through our various senses, our eyes in particular, but also hearing and touch and so on. And also then interpret that scent data that's coming to us. So it might be that you spotted a teammate perform a run, and you're going to play the ball to her as she runs down the wing, something like that. Or maybe hearing a call from behind you, a man-on call, for example, and responding to that call. Those would be perceptual skills, knowing what that call meant and what the correct response would be. So we've got cognitive skills, we've got perceptual skills, and then we've got motor skills. So these are the skills of actual movement. So these would be the obvious things really, like running, throwing, kicking, jumping, and so on, and finer skills than those as well. Now obviously this is just a way of categorizing. Most skills in sport require some combination of these 3 things, and your body is a unit, isn't it? We don't have each of these things separated out as separate things. It's just a way of classifying what is the dominant or the predominant element of a particular skill that we're talking about. So that's one way of classifying skills, is according to what type it is. Is it mostly cognitive? Is it mostly perceptual? Or is it mostly a motor skill? Another way of thinking about skills is what is the effect of the environment on the skill? And what's not meant by that is, I don't mean the weather or anything like that, but I mean what is going on around you in the sport or in the game that you're playing. So we have either open skills or closed skills. These are terms that relate to, or that explain the relation between the skill and the environment. An open skill is one where the action or the skill is varied according to the actions of opponents and changes in environment. So that is when a player that you're playing against moves, you respond as a consequence. You might select your skill on the basis of their movement. You might select your skill on the basis of a shot that they've just returned to you, for example, if we were thinking about racket sports. So if somebody responds and returns a shot over the net to you, you are responding to something external. You're responding to something that's varied in the environment. So therefore, that skill, that response, is an open skill. If there are no such things to concern yourself with, you're not responding to an opponent's shot, or you're not responding to an opponent's movement directly, then the skill can be said to be a closed skill. So a closed skill, the action in a closed skill happens irrespective of the opponents and irrespective of any changes in environment. So the example we've got here is in archery, where the skill is separated or bracketed off in time from your opponent's shots. You don't have to respond to their shots in a direct sense. You're obviously trying to beat them, but the skill itself is performed irrespective of the opponent or changes in the environment. So that would be an open and a closed skill. Another way then that we can classify skills is according to the precision of the movement of that skill. How precise does that movement have to be? And we've got a continuum here from fine all the way through to gross. So a fine movement or a fine skill, right the way through to a gross movement or a gross skill. So a fine skill is one in which there are small, intricate movements of specific body parts. And I've used the example of archery again here because, as you know, in archery there are some small, intricate movements, the fingers and the arm and so on, whereas the majority of the rest of the body is relatively uninvolved. And then across on the other end of the continuum, we've got the gross movements of a game such as American football or gridiron. And we have, for example, throwing and catching, running with the ball and so on. Those would be gross movements in which large muscle groups move the whole body. So the precision of the movement from fine, where we've got these small intricate movements, right through to these gross movements where there's these large whole body movements, is another good way, another helpful way of classifying skills. We can also classify skills based on how the movement of that skill begins and ends. So the beginning and the end of the movement also helps us to classify what we're talking about when we're talking about skills. So first off, here on the left hand side, we've got the example of throwing a dart at a dartboard. That would be something where you would know as a discrete skill because it's a single movement with a clear beginning and a clear ending. So a discrete movement is any movement that's bracketed off again in time, has a clear start to the movement and a clear end to the movement, or a clear start to the skill and a clear end to the skill, the throwing of a dart, for example. That would class as a discrete skill. Now, a serial skill in the middle of the screen, a serial skill is a skill in which there are several discrete movements, so those movements with a clear beginning and end, that are chained together or joined together in a set order. So the example I've given here is the parallel bars in gymnastics, where there are a series of skills that are they are to some extent tied together, and scores are often based on how well they're constructed and tied together. But the separate skills that go in to make up a performance on the bars, those skills themselves, strictly speaking, can be broken down into their separate parts. So we have these several discrete movements joined together in a set order. Another good example of this might be the triple jump, where the sections or the segments of the overall skill can be broken down into sections, into parts, and then added and put together over time. So in your training, you might train separate segments of the skill or of the movement, and then you put them together to make an overall skill. Well, the separate segments would be discrete skills, and when you put them end to end and wedge them together or join them together or chain them, then you've got a serial skill. And then finally, according to the beginning and the end of the movement of the skill, we've got this idea of continuous skills. So a continuous skill is one in which there's an unbroken flow of movement with no obvious beginning or end. There's no point at which you can say, okay, that is the start of the movement of cycling and this is the end of the movement of cycling, because as the name suggests, cycling, it goes round in circles. So the skill itself or the flow of movement, same with running, same with swimming, the movement is a repetitive cycle. It goes round and round, it flows on. There's no clear start point to the movement, no obvious beginning or no obvious ending to the movement. So we can classify skills according to whether or not they have a clear beginning or an end. Discrete skills are those with a clear start and a clear end. Serial skills are those where several discrete skills are tagged along together in a chain. And a continuous skill is one where there is no real clear start or end to the skill, but there's this unbroken flow of movement. And then finally, then we've got timing and pacing of the skill. And the continuum here is between a self-paced skill and an externally paced skill. So a self-paced skill essentially is where the performer of the skill has control over the timing and the speed of the movement. So you have control in snooker or in pool, you have control as to when you go down to the table, when you take the shot, how hard you hit the shot, and so on. So you have absolute control over the pacing as well as the timing of that skill. But then at the other end of the continuum, where you're responding, so this would be, for example, in skills that are open skills, when you're responding to the movement of a ball, for example, and the example here is volleyball, you are responding to someone else's movement. So the timing and the speed of the skill is determined by factors such as the environment or the opponent. So the speed of the ball will determine for you how quickly you need to move your feet. It will determine for you how low you need to dive and how fast you need to move your arms and so on. So the timing and the pacing of the skill is determined by something or someone outside of you. So therefore we say that that sort of skill is externally paced. And most team games, most team sports, field games, invasion games and so on, they pretty much tend to be externally paced. There might be the odd occasion, for example, a penalty kick in football where it's self-paced, but for the most part, team sports are externally paced. So that's a final and fifth way of classifying or categorizing different types of skills in sport. So just to recap then, types of skill, we talked about the cognitive, we talked about the perceptual, and we talked about the motor. Then we talked about the effect of the environment. Are we talking about open or closed skills? Then we discussed the precision of the movement. Are we talking about fine or gross skills? Distinctiveness of the beginning and the ending of the movement was discrete and serial and continuous skills. And then the timing and pacing of the skills, were we talking about self-paced skills or externally paced skills? And obviously different sporting skills can be put into a range of these different kinds of classifications or categories. So that's it for this video. I hope that's been helpful to you. Any comments, please leave them in the comments section and I'll get back to you. Any questions as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification icon, and I'll see you in the next video. But take care for now.